What happens when a group of racists targets a black man thinking that he is a nobody, only to discover that he is the chief of police? What happens next would uncover a massive operation to target minorities in the city. Watch as hundreds of police and SWAT officers fight back against the tyranny and attempt to foil their heinous plans. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. Elijah Carter strolled through the park, savoring the rare moments of peace his position as police chief afforded him. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the trees, and the distant sounds of children playing provided a soothing backdrop. He adjusted his jacket, aware of the weight of his badge tucked away in an inner pocket. This was his time to blend in, to shed the authority, and just be another man enjoying the day. A sharp whistle cut through the air, pulling Elijah's attention toward a nearby bench. 3 men leaned casually against it, their pale faces flushed with cheap beer and mischief. One of them, a wiry figure with a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face, nodded in Elijah's direction. "Hey, big guy," the wiry man called, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Nice day for a stroll, huh?" Elijah met the man's gaze briefly, but chose not to respond. He had seen this kind of bravado before. Men who found power in numbers and sought validation through intimidation. He kept walking, his pace steady, but not hurried. "Don't be rude now," another man jeered, louder this time. He was stockier, with arms crossed over a grimy tank top. "We're just saying hi." The third man chuckled, his laugh low and guttural. "Guess he thinks he's too good for us." Elijah felt the heat of their eyes on his back as he continued along the path. He knew better than to engage, but his instincts sharpened. They weren't done. Not yet. The sound of footsteps quickened behind him. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" the stocky man barked, now closer. Elijah paused, turning slowly to face the group. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The wiry man stepped forward, a glint of malice in his eyes. "You look like the helpful type," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you can help us figure out why someone like you thinks he belongs in this part of town." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I didn't realize this park belonged to anyone in particular." The stocky man smirked. "Oh, it doesn't, but you know how it is. Some places are better off without certain types hanging around." The laughter that followed was as sharp as the tension now thick in the air. Elijah scanned their faces, noting the subtle shifts in their stances. They were testing him, looking for any sign of weakness or fear. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "You've made your point," Elijah said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy the rest of my walk." He turned to leave, but the wiry man's voice stopped him. "Walking away, huh? Figures. Guess you're not as tough as you look." Elijah exhaled slowly, feeling the first flicker of anger in his chest. He knew this wasn't over, but he also knew the importance of choosing the right moment to act. For now, he would let them dig their own hole. As the men's laughter echoed behind him, Elijah resumed his path, his senses heightened. He could hear their footsteps trailing him, the tension rising with each step. Elijah's calm exterior belied the storm brewing inside him. He kept his stride measured, refusing to quicken his pace despite the escalating tension. The men's footsteps grew louder, their shadows stretching alongside his as they closed the distance. "Hey! Don't walk away like we're not talking to you!" The wiry man's voice carried a sharper edge now, his frustration evident. "We just want to have a friendly chat. Is that too much to ask?" Elijah came to a halt and turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the group. "You've already made your intentions clear," he said firmly. "I suggest you leave it at that." The stocky man stepped forward, his smirk widening. "Oh, we're just getting started, friend. You're walking through our park, and you think you can just ignore us? That's kinda disrespectful, don't you think? Your park?" Elijah's voice remained steady, but his gaze sharpened. "Didn't realize public property came with private ownership." The third man, taller and broader than the others, cracked his knuckles. "Maybe someone needs to teach you how things work around here." Elijah's eyes flicked between the three of them, noting their positioning. The wiry one was the instigator, all bark with just enough bite to stir trouble. The stocky one had an air of bravado, feeding off the group's energy. The tall one was the real muscle, stepping in only when the stakes escalated. Classic dynamic, Elijah thought, but dangerous nonetheless. "Let's not make this more than it needs to be," Elijah said, his tone measured but commanding. "Walk away, and we can all enjoy the rest of our day." The wiry man scoffed, taking another step closer. "You don't get it, do you? Guys like you don't get to just walk through here like you own the place. You think your big words and fancy clothes mean anything to us?" Elijah didn't respond immediately. He could feel the eyes of other park-goers on them now. Families hastily ushering children away, joggers pretending not to notice. The men weren't just looking for a fight. They were looking to make a spectacle. The stocky man crossed his arms, leaning in slightly. "What's wrong, huh? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to say something?" Elijah took a step forward, closing the gap between them. His voice dropped, calm but with an unmistakable edge. "Scared? No. I just have nothing to prove to men like you." The wiry man's sneer twisted into a scowl. "Men like us? You got a problem with us now?" "No," Elijah replied, his eyes steady. "But you clearly have a problem with me. So let's cut the games. What do you really want?" For a moment, the group hesitated, caught off guard by Elijah's directness. But the tension snapped as the tall man chuckled darkly. "You're either brave or stupid, old man. Talking to us like that when you're all alone." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Alone? You sure about that?" His words landed like a challenge, and the wiry man bristled. "You think you're untouchable or something? Let's see how tough you are when there's no badge to hide behind." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his chest tightened. They didn't know who he was yet, but the stakes were escalating. He could feel the shift in their posture, the unspoken decision to take things to the next level. "I'm giving you one last chance," Elijah said, his tone firmer now. "Turn around and walk away." "This doesn't have to end badly for you." The stocky man let out a mocking laugh. "Listen to this guy, acting like he's got the upper hand." The wiry man motioned to the others, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "I think it's time we show him how things work around here." Elijah's muscles tensed as the group advanced, their taunts growing louder and more emboldened. He didn't back away. Not yet. He knew the confrontation was inevitable now, but he would be ready when it came. Elijah's heart thudded steadily in his chest, the kind of rhythm that came with experience, calm under pressure. No wasted movement, but the tension was razor-sharp now, and he knew it was only a matter of seconds before everything erupted. The stocky man's sneer deepened as he jabbed a finger at Elijah. "Think you're real tough, huh? Let's see how tough when you're flat on your back." Before Elijah could respond, the wiry man darted forward, swinging wildly. Elijah shifted his weight, narrowly dodging the first punch. But the wiry man followed up with another blow that clipped Elijah's jaw. The sharp jolt of pain sparked his adrenaline, and Elijah's counterattack came fast. A straight jab to the wiry man's chest that knocked the wind out of him and sent him stumbling back. "Get him!" the stocky man roared, barreling toward Elijah. His fists came in heavy, a looping right hook that Elijah blocked with his forearm. But the man's left hand followed, landing a solid hit to Elijah's ribs. Pain radiated through his side, but Elijah gritted his teeth, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard. The stocky man howled, his grip loosening just enough for Elijah to shove him backward. The tall man wasted no time. He charged in with surprising speed for his size, grabbing Elijah by the shoulders and slamming him against a nearby tree. The impact stole Elijah's breath for a moment, and the tall man's fist followed, crashing into his side. Gasping, Elijah managed to bring his knee up, slamming it into the man's thigh. The tall man grunted, his grip faltering, and Elijah capitalized on the opening, driving his elbow into the man's jaw. The wiry man was back on his feet now, blood trickling from his lip. He let out a guttural yell and launched himself at Elijah, tackling him to the ground. The world spun as Elijah hit the dirt hard, the wiry man's fists raining down. He blocked one punch, but took another to his temple, the sting disorienting him. Twisting his hips, Elijah rolled them over, reversing the position. His fist came down in a precise arc, striking the wiry man's cheek and silencing his barrage. Elijah pushed off the wiry man just in time to see the stocky one coming again. The man's meaty fist collided with Elijah's shoulder, sending him stumbling sideways. Elijah caught himself and retaliated with a quick jab to the man's nose, the satisfying crack of cartilage accompanying the stocky man's howl of pain. "Hold him!" the tall man barked, charging back into the fray. He and the stocky man moved in tandem, one grabbing for Elijah's arms while the other swung wildly. Elijah twisted, breaking free from the grip, but not before a punch slammed into his gut, forcing the air from his lungs. He staggered back, vision blurring for a moment. The tall man smirked, closing in with a haymaker aimed at Elijah's head. Ducking low, Elijah avoided the blow by inches and delivered a brutal uppercut to the man's chin. The tall man reeled, dazed, but still standing. Breathing hard, Elijah pivoted just as the wiry man lunged again, a makeshift weapon, a broken bottle, glinting in his hand. The man swung recklessly, and Elijah barely dodged the jagged edge, his jacket tearing as the glass sliced through the fabric. Using the man's momentum against him, Elijah grabbed his wrist, twisting it hard enough to make him drop the bottle. Elijah followed with a sharp kick to the wiry man's knee, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Stay down!" Elijah barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. But the stocky man wasn't finished. Blood dripping from his nose, he came in with a roar. Swinging a wild punch, Elijah blocked it with his forearm, though the impact sent a fresh jolt of pain through his ribs. With a surge of effort, Elijah drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him backward into a tree. The stocky man slumped to the ground, groaning. The tall man, unsteady but furious, lunged one last time. Elijah sidestepped, hooking his foot behind the man's ankle and sending him crashing face first into the dirt. The man tried to rise, but Elijah planted a firm knee in his back, pinning him. Breathing heavily, Elijah glanced around. The wiry man lay clutching his knee, the stocky one slumped and wheezing, and the tall man groaned under Elijah's weight. The park had grown eerily quiet, save for the ragged breathing of his attackers and the pounding in Elijah's ears. Pain radiated through his ribs and jaw, but he forced himself to stay upright. He couldn't let them see weakness, not yet. "You had your chance," Elijah said, his voice low and resolute. "Now you'll face the consequences." Elijah stayed kneeling on the tall man's back, his chest heaving as he fought to steady his breath. Every inch of his body ached. His ribs throbbed from the blows he'd taken, and his knuckles stung from the force of his punches. Yet his focus didn't waver. These men weren't finished yet. He could see it in their eyes. The wiry man sat up slowly, clutching his knee and glaring at Elijah with a mix of hatred and disbelief. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "You're gonna regret this, old man." Elijah's lip curled, a rare flash of anger breaking through his usually composed demeanor. "No, you're the ones who will regret it." The stocky man struggled to his feet, wiping the blood from his nose. "Big words for someone who's about to get stomped," he sneered, though his bravado faltered as Elijah reached into his jacket pocket. From the depths of his coat, Elijah withdrew his badge, holding it up for all three men to see. The gleaming metal caught the light, its authority undeniable. "Chief of Police," Elijah said, his voice low and steady, cutting through their lingering defiance like a blade. "Elijah Carter, you just assaulted the highest-ranking officer in this city." The wiry man froze, his sneer melting into shock. "What?" The stocky man's eyes darted between the badge and Elijah's face, his bravado evaporating. "No way," he muttered. "You're lying." "Am I?" Elijah countered, leaning forward just enough for his words to hit like a punch. Do you really want to find out the hard way? For a moment, the three attackers were silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The tall man beneath Elijah squirmed, trying to crane his neck to get a look at the badge. He's bluffing, he growled, though his tone lacked conviction. You sure about that? Elijah asked, tightening his grip on the tall man's shoulder. Because right now, your options are limited. You can either run like cowards and pray I don't catch up to you, or you can try to finish what you started and guarantee your trip to prison. The wiry man's face twisted into a grimace, his bravado crumbling into panic. He pushed himself backward, his injured leg dragging uselessly behind him. Screw this, he muttered, scrambling to his feet. The stocky man hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching as if weighing his options. We can take him, he said, though his voice cracked under the strain of uncertainty. He's hurt. Elijah rose to his full height, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the three men. Try me, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. But know this, I don't go down easy. And if you lay another hand on me, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life. The tall man growled in frustration, shoving Elijah off as he scrambled to his feet. He towered over the others, his eyes darting between Elijah and his companions. Let's go, he barked, though the command carried more desperation than authority. This ain't worth it. The wiry man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and limped away as fast as his injured leg would allow, casting a final hateful glare over his shoulder. The stocky man followed suit, muttering curses under his breath as he stumbled into the shadows. The tall man lingered for a moment, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. He took a step toward Elijah, his face contorted with fury. But the sight of the badge and Elijah's unwavering stare stopped him in his tracks. With a frustrated growl, he turned and stalked off, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet park. Elijah stood alone now, his breaths coming in sharp bursts. The tension in his muscles slowly unwound, replaced by the dull ache of his injuries. He tucked his badge back into his jacket and glanced around the park. Families and joggers who had witnessed the confrontation were nowhere to be seen. The park was eerily silent, as though holding its breath. Pain radiated through his ribs as he straightened his posture. But Elijah pushed it aside. The fight might have been over, but this was only the beginning. He couldn't shake the feeling that these men were more than just aimless thugs. Their coordinated aggression, their confidence, it all pointed to something larger. As the fading sounds of the attackers' retreat melted into the distance, Elijah pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed a familiar number. "Carter here," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "We've got a situation. I need a team at Greenridge Park, and make it fast." Elijah lowered his phone and slipped it back into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. The familiar sting of pain surged through his body now that the fight was over. His ribs throbbed with each breath. His jaw ached where a punch had landed, and his side burned where the wiry man's bottle had grazed him. He pressed a hand against his ribs, wincing at the sharp jolt that shot through his torso. The park was still, the echoes of the confrontation fading into the cool evening air. The golden hues of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the grass, painting a scene that felt oddly tranquil despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Elijah sank onto a nearby bench, his legs shaky beneath him. He leaned back, letting his head rest against the cool metal, and exhaled a long, slow breath. He needed to stay alert, but his body demanded rest. Blood trickled from a cut on his brow, warm against his skin. He pressed his sleeve against it, grimacing at the sting. In the distance, he heard the faint wail of sirens, relief mixed with frustration as the sound grew louder. He knew his team would arrive soon, but he hated the thought of being found like this, injured and vulnerable. He was the chief of police, the figure meant to embody strength and control. Yet here he was, battered and bloodied in the middle of a park. Moments later, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the trees, as two squad cars pulled up near the path. Uniformed officers spilled out, their faces a mix of concern and urgency as they spotted him. "Chief Carter!" one of them called out, jogging over with a hand on his radio. "Are you all right?" Elijah raised a hand to signal he was conscious, though he doubted "all right" was the word to describe his condition. "I'll live," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I've been better." Another officer, a young man with wide eyes, crouched beside him. "We've got medics on the way," he said. "What happened here?" "3 men," Elijah replied, his tone clipped as he fought to keep his composure. "They attacked me. They ran when they realized who I was." The first officer frowned, glancing around the empty park. "Did you recognize them?" "No," Elijah said, shaking his head. "But they're part of something bigger. I want patrols in this area doubled starting tonight. No one walks this park alone until we get them." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, sir." The younger officer stood, his radio crackling with updates from the incoming ambulance. "Chief, we should get you checked out. You're bleeding." Elijah waved him off, though the motion made his ribs protest. "I'll wait for the medics," he said, "but I need someone to secure the scene. There might be evidence here, something we can use to track them." As the officers fanned out to follow his orders, Elijah leaned back against the bench, letting his eyes close for a moment. The sirens faded into the background as his mind replayed the fight in sharp detail. He could still see the wiry man's snarl, feel the tall man's weight slamming him into the tree. But it wasn't just their faces that haunted him. It was their confidence, their belief that they could attack him without consequence. This wasn't random. Elijah knew that now. These men had a purpose, a reason for targeting him, and he intended to find out what it was. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts as 2 paramedics approached, their gear bags in hand. "Chief Carter?" one of them asked, her tone gentle but firm. "That's me," Elijah muttered, sitting up straighter despite the protest of his ribs. "We're going to check you out," she said, crouching beside him and opening her kit. "Can you tell us what hurts?" Elijah gestured to his ribs, jaw, and side. "Took a few hits," he admitted. "Probably bruised ribs. Nothing broken, I think." The paramedic nodded, her hands moving efficiently as she examined him. "You're lucky it's not worse," she said after a moment. "But you should get an X-ray to be sure." "I'll think about it," Elijah replied, though he already knew he'd be back at the station before the hour was out. There was too much work to do. As the paramedics worked, Elijah's radio crackled to life. "Detective Lopez en route," came the voice of one of his trusted officers. "ETA 2 minutes." Elijah smiled faintly, despite the pain. Maria Lopez didn't waste time. He knew she'd be ready to dig into this case with the same tenacity she brought to every investigation. And this time, they wouldn't stop until the whole operation came crashing down. The whir of the ambulance's engine faded into the distance as Elijah stood near the edge of the park, watching his officers work. Though his ribs ached with every breath and his side throbbed, he refused to leave the scene. His badge demanded resilience, and his instincts told him there was more to uncover here. Detective Maria Lopez arrived in her unmarked car, stepping out with a sharp focus that immediately shifted to Elijah. She was in her mid-30s, her dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes carried the fire of someone who didn't tolerate loose ends. Her gaze flicked over Elijah's bruises, her expression tightening. "You look like you went 3 rounds in the ring," she said, walking up to him. "You should be in a hospital." "I've been through worse," Elijah replied, brushing off the comment. "What matters now is finding those men and figuring out what they're a part of." Lopez sighed but didn't press the issue. She pulled out a notepad and flipped it open. "What do we know so far?" Elijah gestured toward the bench where the confrontation had started. 3 men. Coordinated. They weren't just looking for a fight. They were targeting me. Or at least someone like me. Lopez raised an eyebrow. "You think this was planned?" "They weren't amateurs," Elijah said firmly. "Their confidence, the way they escalated, it wasn't random. And when they ran, they didn't scatter. They left together. Organized." Lopez nodded, jotting down notes. "Did they say anything that stood out?" Something that might give us a lead? They made it clear they didn't want me in this park. Beyond that, nothing specific. Elijah hesitated, his mind racing through the encounter. But this isn't the first time I've heard about groups like this operating in the city. Lopez glanced up, her pen hovering above the notepad. You think they're tied to the attacks we've been hearing about? The ones targeting minorities? It's a strong possibility, Elijah replied, his jaw tightening. We've never been able to pin down enough evidence to make arrests, but this might be our chance. Lopez's eyes darkened, and she snapped her notepad shut. Then we don't waste time. I'll get the patrols combing this area for witnesses and security footage. Maybe we can pick up a trail. Elijah nodded, his gratitude silent but clear. Good. And have someone pull the files on any unsolved assault cases with similar patterns. If these men are connected, I want to know everything they've been involved in. As Lopez walked off to coordinate with the officers, Elijah turned his attention back to the bench where the fight had ended. His sharp eyes scanned the ground, searching for anything the men might have left behind. A glint of glass caught his eye, and he crouched down, wincing as his ribs protested. It was the broken bottle the wiry man had wielded, its jagged edge still stained with blood. His blood. Chief, a uniformed officer called, hurrying over. We found this near the path where they ran. The officer held up a small piece of fabric, a torn sleeve with a distinctive patch stitched onto it. Elijah took it, his brow furrowing as he examined the symbol. It wasn't one he recognized immediately, but it was clearly intentional, marking the group's identity. Get this to forensics, Elijah ordered, and see if anyone in intel recognizes this symbol. It might be the key to figuring out who they are. The officer nodded and jogged off, leaving Elijah standing with the patch in his hand. Lopez returned a moment later, her phone in hand. We might have something, she said, her voice steady but urgent. One of the patrol cars spotted 3 men matching your description, heading into an abandoned warehouse on the east side of town. Elijah's grip tightened on the patch. That's their hideout. It has to be. I already sent a team to check it out, Lopez said. If they're there, we'll have them in custody by the end of the night. Elijah's eyes narrowed, determination hardening his features. Be careful. These men are dangerous, and they won't go down without a fight. Lopez gave him a small, reassuring smile. We'll handle it. You just focus on not collapsing before this is over. Elijah chuckled dryly, though the motion sent a fresh wave of pain through his side. Noted. As Lopez turned to leave, Elijah pocketed the torn patch, his mind already racing ahead. This was more than an attack on him. It was part of a larger pattern, one that he'd been chasing for years without concrete proof. But now, with this lead, he finally had a chance to dismantle the operation and ensure justice was served. Elijah sat at his desk in the precinct, staring at the patch they'd recovered from the park. The symbol was distinct but unfamiliar, a jagged line cutting through a circle, like a crude brand. His ribs still throbbed with each breath, and the cut on his brow had been hastily bandaged, but his focus never wavered. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had likely suffered at the hands of these men. Detective Maria Lopez entered the room, her face tight with frustration. She set a file on his desk with a heavy sigh. The warehouse came up empty, she said, her tone clipped. No sign of them. Just a lot of beer cans and trash. Elijah frowned, picking up the file and flipping through it. The report confirmed her words. No suspects, no weapons, no additional clues. The warehouse had been abandoned long before the patrols arrived. Any footage from the area? He asked, not looking up from the papers. Lopez shook her head. Street cameras nearby were either too far or angled the wrong way. It's like they know exactly where to move to stay off the grid. Elijah closed the file, leaning back in his chair with a grim expression. They're careful, which means they've done this before. They know how to avoid leaving a trail. Lopez nodded, sitting across from him. We've got officers canvassing the neighborhood, but so far no one's talking. Either they didn't see anything, or they're too scared to come forward. Scared makes sense, Elijah said, his voice heavy. These men aren't just a group of random thugs. They're organized, And they've clearly built a reputation. Lopez leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. We need more. Something concrete. If we can't find them, we can't tie them to the other assaults. Elijah set the file down and rubbed his temples. The frustration was palpable, but he refused to let it consume him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced an uphill battle, and it wouldn't be the last. What about the patch? Forensics turn anything up? Lopez gestured to the symbol on the desk. Not yet. It's not tied to any known gangs or organizations in our database. But I sent a copy of it to some old contacts in neighboring cities. Maybe they've seen it before. Good, Elijah said. We need every advantage we can get. A knock on the door interrupted them. Officer Thompson, a young and eager patrolman, poked his head in. Chief, detective, just got a call from one of our sources downtown. They've heard rumors about a group matching your description. Word is, they're tied to an underground network targeting specific neighborhoods. Elijah's brow furrowed. What kind of neighborhoods? Thompson hesitated. Minority-heavy areas, sir. They target people they think won't fight back. Quiet intimidation most of the time. But when someone pushes back, he trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Lopez clenched her jaw, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of her chair. And no one's come forward about this? No victims? No witnesses? People are scared, Thompson admitted. These guys don't just attack people, they send messages. And when someone crosses them, it doesn't end with one fight. Elijah exchanged a glance with Lopez, the weight of the situation settling over them both. If this is true, Elijah said, his voice firm, we're not just dealing with a gang. We're dealing with domestic terrorists. Lopez nodded grimly. And they're smart enough to know how to cover their tracks. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Then, we need to flush them out. We find their weak link, someone who's not as loyal or as careful, and we make them talk. Lopez raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting we go undercover? It's risky, Elijah admitted. But at this point, it's our best option. If they've been targeting neighborhoods, someone has to know more. We start there. Lopez stood, her resolve firm. I'll pull the files on recent assaults in those areas. Maybe we can identify a pattern, something that points us in the right direction. Good, Elijah said, rising to his feet despite the protest from his ribs. And I'll reach out to our community liaisons. If anyone knows where these men are hiding, it's the people they've been terrorizing. As Lopez left the room to begin her search, Elijah stared at the patch one last time before slipping it into his pocket. The symbol was more than just a mark. It was a challenge, a sign that these men thought they were untouchable. They're wrong, Elijah muttered to himself, his jaw tightening. We'll find them. The car ride was silent, save for the faint hum of the engine as Detective Maria Lopez drove Elijah toward the outskirts of the city. The lead they'd uncovered, a suspicious meeting rumored to involve the gang, was tenuous, but it was the best they had. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, his ribs tightly bandaged beneath his shirt, his eyes scanning the thickening forest beyond the highway. This is a long way from their usual territory, Lopez said, breaking the silence. You think they're meeting here to stay off the radar? Most likely, Elijah replied, his tone even. If they're as organized as we think, they'd want a place where no one would stumble on them by accident. Lopez tightened her grip on the wheel. And if this is a dead end? Elijah glanced at her, his expression unwavering. Then we keep digging. But something tells me we won't be leaving empty-handed. They pulled off the main road, following a dirt path that wound deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. Lopez slowed the car, cutting the headlights as they approached a small clearing. She parked behind a cluster of thick bushes, ensuring the vehicle remained hidden. We'll go on foot from here, Elijah said, stepping out and wincing slightly as his ribs protested. He adjusted his jacket, concealing his badge and firearm. Lopez did the same, the quiet rustle of her holster the only sound in the still air. They moved cautiously through the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath their boots muffled by years of experience. Elijah's sharp eyes caught a faint glow in the distance, a flickering light that grew brighter as they drew closer. The murmur of voices soon reached them, low and guttural, carrying an edge of anger that sent a chill down Elijah's spine. Lopez motioned for Elijah to stop, and they crouched behind a thick tree trunk. Peering through the branches, they saw a makeshift clearing illuminated by a large bonfire. Around it stood a group of 20, maybe 30 men. Their heads were shaved, and their clothing bore the same jagged circle emblem as the patch they'd found. Elijah's stomach tightened as he took in the scene. The men were chanting, their voices rising in unison, punctuated by jeers and laughter. At the center of the group stood a man who was clearly their leader, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down one side of his face. He raised his arms, commanding their attention. "This is our time," the leader bellowed, his voice carrying over the crackling fire. "For too long, we've been pushed aside, forced to watch as they take what's ours." The crowd erupted in cheers, their fists pumping in the air. Elijah clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The leader's words were inflammatory, laced with hatred, each sentence fueling the mob's fervor. "They think they can silence us, but we won't be silenced," the leader continued, his voice rising. "This city belongs to us, and we'll take it back one street at a time." Lopez's hand tightened on Elijah's arm, pulling him back slightly. "We can't take them all," she whispered. "Not now, I know," Elijah replied, his voice low but firm. "But we need to know more. Who they are, what they're planning." The chanting grew louder, the mob's energy reaching a fever pitch. The leader gestured to a table near the bonfire, where maps and papers were laid out. He picked up a piece of paper, holding it high for all to see. "These are the targets," he shouted. "We strike first, and they'll know fear. They'll know who really runs this city." Elijah's breath hitched. The map, even from this distance, was clearly marked with several locations. Neighborhoods, businesses, even public parks. Places filled with families, children, innocent people. "We have to get closer," Elijah murmured, his mind racing. "We need that map." Lopez hesitated, her eyes flicking back to the mob. "We'll never make it without being spotted." Elijah's gaze hardened. "Then we wait for our opening." As the leader continued his tirade, Elijah and Lopez crouched lower, their eyes fixed on the bonfire. They couldn't act yet, not without backup, and not without risking their lives. But one thing was clear. This was no small gang. It was a coordinated movement, and it was on the brink of unleashing chaos. The minutes stretched on as Elijah and Lopez remained hidden, watching the mob with growing unease. The leader's voice carried over the fire, his words weaving a narrative of hate and power, galvanizing the men around him. "They think we're weak," the leader snarled, pacing around the bonfire. "They think we'll just roll over while they take what's ours. But tonight, we show them what we're made of." The crowd roared in approval, their chanting blending into a primal rhythm. Several men began moving toward the table, pointing at the map and exchanging low, hurried words. From their gestures, Elijah could tell they were dividing tasks, each group taking responsibility for a different target. "This isn't just posturing," Lopez whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're planning an attack." Elijah nodded grimly. "And they've been preparing for a while." The leader raised his hands again, silencing the crowd. "You've all been chosen for a reason," he said, his tone almost reverent. "You have the strength, the resolve, to do what needs to be done. And when the dust settles, they'll know we're not just a group. We're a force." The men cheered again, some pounding their chests, others raising their fists to the sky. Elijah's stomach churned. This was more than a hate group. It was a calculated operation, designed to spread fear and violence. Lopez shifted beside him, her hand hovering near her holster. "We can't let them leave with those plans." Elijah's gaze didn't waver from the scene before him. "We won't. But we need to call for backup. If we move now, we'll only get ourselves killed." Lopez nodded reluctantly, reaching for her radio. "This is Detective Lopez," she whispered. "We've got a situation. Need immediate backup." Before she could finish, a twig snapped underfoot. The sound was small, barely audible, but in the tense quiet of the forest, it was enough. Several heads turned toward their hiding spot, their faces twisting in suspicion. Elijah's heart pounded as the men nearest the edge of the clearing began moving toward them. Their cover was blown, and time was running out. The snap of the twig echoed in Elijah's ears like a gunshot, sharp and final. His stomach dropped as the men nearest the clearing turned toward their hiding spot, their faces twisting with suspicion. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and Elijah could feel the weight of their gazes bearing down on him and Lopez. "There!" one of them barked, pointing into the shadows. Elijah's instincts kicked in before his mind could catch up. "Move!" he hissed, grabbing Lopez by the arm and yanking her to her feet. They bolted into the darkness, the forest coming alive with the pounding of boots and angry shouts behind them. "Don't let them get away!" a voice roared, its anger cutting through the night like a blade. Elijah's pulse thundered in his ears as he sprinted, the forest a blur of blackened trunks and tangled roots. The shouts were close, too close, and every frantic step seemed to echo, announcing their location to the mob. His ribs screamed with each jarring movement, but the sharp sting of fear drowned out the pain. Lopez ran beside him, her breaths ragged, her face pale in the faint moonlight. "They're right behind us," she gasped, glancing over her shoulder. Elijah didn't need to look to know she was right. The heavy footsteps and guttural curses of their pursuers were growing louder, their rage palpable. The shadows of the forest seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against Elijah's vision, but he forced himself to focus on the path ahead. A shout erupted from their left, and Elijah caught a glimpse of two men cutting through the trees to flank them. "They're trying to box us in," he growled, veering sharply to the right. Branches whipped at his face and tore at his clothes as he pushed through the underbrush. The forest felt endless, its twists and turns disorienting, but stopping wasn't an option. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound amplified the sensation of being hunted. "They're gaining!" Lopez cried, her voice trembling. Elijah's breath hitched as he spotted a fallen tree ahead, its massive trunk blocking their path. "Up and over!" he shouted, his voice rough with strain. Lopez reached the tree first, vaulting over it with a burst of desperation. Elijah followed, his ribs protesting as he hauled himself over the rough bark. He landed hard, the impact jarring, and for a split second, the world spun. Lopez grabbed his arm, steadying him, her wide eyes scanning the shadows. "Go!" she urged, panic sharpening her voice. "They're coming!" The mob reached the tree moments later, their shouts rising to a frenzy. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness, the beams slicing through the trees like searchlights. Some men scrambled over the trunk, while others found gaps in the underbrush to squeeze through. The delay bought Elijah and Lopez precious seconds, but it wasn't enough. A sharp crack rang out, and Elijah's heart lurched as a bullet whizzed past, splintering a tree just inches from his head. He ducked instinctively, his mind racing. They weren't just chasing them. They were trying to kill them. "They're armed!" he called, his voice tight with fear. Lopez grabbed his arm again, pulling him forward. "No time to fight! Keep moving!" The sound of the mob grew louder, their voices blending into a cacophony of anger and hatred. Elijah's chest tightened as he realized just how many were behind them. He had faced danger before. Gunfights, raids, life-and-death moments, but this was different. The raw, primal hatred radiating from their pursuers was unlike anything he'd ever felt. It wasn't just a chase. It was a hunt. Ahead, the forest began to thin, revealing an open stretch of rocky terrain. It was a risk, but staying in the dense woods meant being cornered. "This way!" Elijah barked, veering toward the clearing. They broke through the tree line, their boots skidding on loose gravel. The open space left them exposed, the pale moonlight illuminating their every move. Elijah's breath came in short, painful bursts as his ribs protested each step. His mind screamed at him to keep going, but the fear was suffocating, threatening to paralyze him with every passing second. Another shot rang out, the crack shattering the fragile silence. The bullet struck the ground near their feet, kicking up dirt and rocks. Elijah stumbled, the shock freezing him for a moment before Lopez grabbed him again, her grip like a lifeline. "Don't stop!" she shouted, her voice shaking. "They're right behind us." The shouts grew closer, the mob refusing to let up. Their footsteps thundered across the rocky terrain, accompanied by the flicker of flashlights bouncing erratically through the darkness. Elijah's legs burned, his body screaming for rest, but the sheer terror of what would happen if they were caught kept him moving. The forest loomed ahead again, darker and denser than before. It was their only chance. "The trees!" Elijah gasped. "We make it there, and we're good." Lopez nodded, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. They reached the edge of the forest just as another shot echoed, the bullet whizzing past her shoulder. Elijah threw himself forward, diving into the shadows. His hands hit damp earth, and he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The mob hesitated at the edge of the trees, their flashlights cutting through the gloom but unable to penetrate the thick underbrush. The shouts grew fainter, the men's voices tinged with frustration. Finally, the sound of their pursuit began to fade. Elijah slumped against a tree, his chest heaving. His entire body ached, his ribs screaming with each breath. But the fear still gripped him, refusing to let go. Lopez collapsed beside him, her face pale and drenched in sweat. I think we lost them." Elijah nodded, his hands trembling as he wiped his face. "For now," he said, his voice hoarse. "But this isn't over, not even close." Elijah leaned heavily against the trunk of a massive oak tree, his chest rising and falling as he fought to catch his breath. The fear from the chase still coursed through him, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The darkness of the forest felt oppressive now, the quiet unsettling after the chaos they had just escaped. Lopez crouched beside him, clutching her knees as she tried to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp, focused. "This isn't just a gang," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "They're planning something big, something we can't afford to ignore." Elijah nodded, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on his mind. "They're not just a group of thugs causing trouble in back alleys," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is organized, coordinated, and if we don't stop them now, people are going to get hurt. A lot of people." Lopez stood, brushing dirt from her pants as she scanned their surroundings. "We've seen the signs before. Isolated attacks, whispers of intimidation in minority neighborhoods. But this?" She shook her head, her tone grim. "This is a full-scale operation. They've got targets, plans. They're ready to escalate." Elijah pushed off the tree, ignoring the protest from his ribs. His gaze was hard, determined. "Then we need to escalate, too. This isn't something we can handle with a few patrol cars and a handful of detectives." Lopez glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "You're talking SWAT?" "I'm talking everything we've got," Elijah replied, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "We need to mobilize a full tactical response. SWAT, precinct-wide support, even federal backup if necessary. These men are a threat to public safety, and we can't take any chances." Lopez nodded, her expression matching his resolve. "What's the first step?" Elijah pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen as he dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Carter, what's going on?" "Captain Reynolds," Elijah said, his tone brisk. "I need immediate SWAT deployment and full precinct support. We've located a group of at least 20 to 30 individuals in the woods east of Greenridge. They're armed, organized, and planning attacks on multiple civilian targets." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Reynolds spoke again, his voice serious. "Do we have confirmation of their plans?" "I saw the map myself," Elijah replied. "They've marked neighborhoods, parks, businesses, places full of innocent people. This isn't speculation, Captain. It's happening." Another pause, then Reynolds exhaled sharply. "All right. I'll get SWAT mobilized and have additional units en route. ETA, less than an hour," Elijah said. We'll stay on site to monitor their movements, but we can't engage without backup. Understood, Reynolds said. Stay safe, Chief. We'll handle this. Elijah ended the call and turned to Lopez. We've got an hour, maybe less. We need to make sure they don't move before the team gets here. Lopez nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her holster. If they spot us again, they won't, Elijah interrupted, his tone firm. We'll keep our distance, stay hidden. But if they try to leave that clearing before SWAT arrives, we'll have no choice but to slow them down. Lopez's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she pulled out her own phone and began relaying orders to nearby officers, coordinating the perimeter. The faint glow of her screen illuminated her face, the tension evident in every line. Elijah took a step back, his eyes scanning the dense forest ahead. The image of the map burned in his mind. The carefully marked location, the leader's impassioned words, the frenzied energy of the crowd. These men weren't just venting their hatred in private. They were preparing to unleash it on the city, to make their violent ideology known through terror. This is bigger than us, Elijah murmured, more to himself than to Lopez. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep growing. More attacks, more fear. They'll rip this city apart. We won't let that happen, Lopez said, her voice cutting through the gloom. Not on our watch, Elijah nodded, the fire in his chest matching the burning pain in his ribs. We've got one shot at this. If they scatter before we take them down, it'll be like trying to catch smoke. They'll regroup, go underground, and come back stronger. Lopez met his gaze, her determination unwavering. Then we don't let them scatter. The forest was quiet again, but the tension hung heavy in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Elijah could feel the weight of his decisions pressing on him, but he didn't falter. This wasn't just another operation. It was a fight for the safety of his city, for the lives of those who couldn't defend themselves against the hate these men carried. As the minutes ticked by, Elijah and Lopez prepared themselves, their movements careful, deliberate. The mob in the clearing had no idea what was coming, but soon they would. And when the dust settled, Elijah vowed they would never terrorize anyone again. Elijah and Lopez crouched behind the thick undergrowth, the cold bite of the night air doing little to cool the tension building between them. Every minute felt like an hour as they watched the clearing, waiting for the sound of sirens and the arrival of SWAT. Elijah checked his watch for what felt like the 100th time. 10 minutes since the call. Backup was on its way, but those 10 minutes felt like a chasm between action and catastrophe. Lopez shifted beside him, her voice barely a whisper. You think they know we're still here? Elijah shook his head, his sharp gaze locked on the clearing. The mob had grown restless, their chants quieter now but still carrying a dangerous energy. The leader, standing near the bonfire, was speaking in low, urgent tones, his hands gesturing to the men surrounding him. They're planning something, Elijah murmured, and they're not waiting around to do it. As if on cue, the leader clapped his hands together, his voice rising above the crackling flames. It's time, he barked, his tone sharp and commanding. We move now. No more waiting, no more delays. Elijah's breath caught. He watched as the men scrambled into action, dousing the fire and packing up their supplies with alarming efficiency. The maps and papers on the table were folded and tucked into a weathered satchel slung over the leader's shoulder. Flashlights flickered to life, cutting through the darkness as the group began splitting into smaller units, each one moving with purpose. They're moving out, Lopez whispered, panic threading through her voice. We don't have enough time. Elijah grabbed his radio, his grip tight as he keyed the mic. Captain Reynolds, this is Carter. The suspects are on the move. Repeat, they're leaving the clearing now. The response crackled through almost immediately. What? SWAT's still 10 minutes out. Can you hold them? Negative, Elijah said firmly. There's too many of them. And they're armed. We can't engage without backup. Damn it, Reynolds cursed, the panic evident in his voice. If they scatter, we'll lose them. And if they're heading for those targets, his voice trailed off, the grim reality sinking in. Elijah tightened his jaw. We need to contain them now. Can you get patrol units to intercept? I'll divert every unit we've got, Reynolds replied. But if they split up, it's going to be chaos. Lopez leaned closer, her face pale in the dim light. If they reach the city, people are going to get hurt. We can't let that happen. Elijah nodded, his mind racing. We follow them. Stay close enough to track where they're headed. Once backup gets here, we'll coordinate and take them down. Reynolds's voice came through again, sharper this time. Be careful, Carter. Don't engage unless you have to. Understood, Elijah said, before clipping the radio back to his belt. He turned to Lopez, his expression grim. Let's move. They rose cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they trailed the group. The skinheads moved with unsettling precision, their flashlights sweeping the ground as they navigated the forest. Their voices were low but determined, their body language exuding the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. Elijah's ribs ached with every step, but he pushed the pain aside. He couldn't afford to slow down, not when lives were on the line. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a vice. This wasn't just a chance to stop a hate group. It was a race against time to prevent a tragedy. As they followed, Elijah caught fragments of conversation drifting back from the group. Words like "strike first" and "send a message" sent a chill down his spine. These men weren't just planning to intimidate, they were preparing to unleash violence. Lopez tapped his arm, her voice barely audible. They're splitting up. Elijah cursed under his breath as he watched smaller groups break off, heading in different directions. The leader stayed with the largest group, his commanding presence guiding their movements. Stay with me, Elijah murmured. We'll follow the leader. He's got the plans. They won't act without him. Lopez nodded, her jaw tight as they adjusted their course. The forest began to thin as they neared the edge of the tree line. Beyond, the faint glow of city lights cut through the night, the urban sprawl stretching out before them like a beacon. Elijah's heart sank. They were too close. If the mob made it to the city, the damage would be catastrophic. The leader raised his arm, signaling his group to halt. He turned to address them, his voice carrying over the still night air. We're almost there. Stick to the plan. No mistakes. Elijah's hand hovered over his radio, his mind racing. SWAT was still minutes away, and the patrol units wouldn't arrive in time to intercept. The mob was about to disappear into the city, and he knew once they did, stopping them would be like chasing smoke. We need to slow them down, Lopez whispered, her voice edged with desperation. If they make it into the city, I know, Elijah said, cutting her off. His mind worked furiously, searching for a solution. The odds were against them, but they couldn't afford to fail. Too much was at stake. Elijah's breath hitched as he watched the group begin their descent toward the city. The leader barked orders, his voice carrying an air of authority that kept his followers in line. The others obeyed without hesitation, their movements precise, almost militaristic. The faint glow of city lights ahead felt closer with every second, a chilling reminder of how little time they had. Elijah grabbed his radio and whispered into it. Reynolds, Carter here. The leader and a few of his men are breaking toward the city. We're following them now, but we need backup immediately. Repeat, we're closing in. SWAT is 2 minutes out, Reynolds responded, his tone clipped. Hold position if you can. Can't hold, Elijah replied firmly. If we wait, they'll disappear into the city. We'll intercept and stall until backup arrives. Lopez shot him a glance, her face pale but determined. You sure about this? Elijah nodded, the resolve in his eyes unshakable. We can't let them slip through. With that, the two moved closer, keeping low as they navigated the thinning forest. The leader's group had split from the others, now down to 5 men including him. Their voices grew clearer as Elijah and Lopez crept closer, their taunts and laughter laced with arrogance. These neighborhoods won't know what hit them, one of the men said, his tone gleeful. By the time they figure it out, we'll be long gone. Stick to the plan, the leader growled, This is only the beginning. Once they see we're serious, they'll fall in line. Elijah's grip tightened on his sidearm. He motioned for Lopez to flank right, signaling her to prepare for a takedown. She nodded, her hand steady as she unholstered her weapon. When the group slowed to check their map under a flashlight's glow, Elijah seized the moment. "Police! Don't move!" he shouted, stepping into the open with his weapon drawn. The men froze, their flashlights swinging wildly before landing on Elijah and Lopez. The leader's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a snarl. "You've got guts," he sneered. "But you're outnumbered. You're done," Elijah said coldly. "Put the map down and get on the ground." "Now!" One of the men hesitated, his hands twitching upward, but the leader snapped, "Don't you dare! They're bluffing!" Elijah took a step forward, his voice sharp as steel. "This isn't a bluff. You're surrounded. Drop the map and surrender, or we'll do this the hard way." For a moment, it seemed like they might comply, but then the leader laughed, a low guttural sound that sent a chill down Elijah's spine. "You think you're going to stop us? You're nothing, just another cog in a broken system." "Enough!" Lopez snapped, her weapon trained on one of the men. "You're under arrest. Don't make this worse for yourselves." The leader's grin twisted into a snarl. "They can't stop what's coming," he growled. "No one can." With a sharp motion, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife. "Come on, then. Let's see if you've got the guts to stop me." Chaos erupted as two of the men lunged forward. Elijah sidestepped the first attacker, his ribs screaming as he pivoted and landed a solid strike to the man's side, sending him sprawling. Lopez fired a warning shot into the ground, freezing the second man mid-step. The leader darted toward the edge of the clearing, the map still clutched in his hand. Elijah shouted, "Lopez, cover me!" before taking off after him. The forest blurred around him as he ran, his heart pounding in his ears. The leader was fast, but Elijah's focus was sharper. He surged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The map flew from the leader's grip, landing in the dirt a few feet away. The leader thrashed beneath him, his knife slashing wildly. Elijah grabbed his wrist, slamming it against the ground until the weapon clattered free. The leader snarled, twisting to throw Elijah off, but Elijah held firm, his training kicking in. "You're done," Elijah spat, his breath ragged. "This ends now." The leader glared up at him, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? This isn't over. It'll never be over." Lopez appeared seconds later, her weapon trained on the leader. "Don't move!" she barked, her voice cutting through the tension. Two of the other men were cuffed and lying face down in the dirt behind her, subdued but still glaring defiantly. Elijah rolled off the leader, pinning him with a knee to the back as he secured his wrists with zip ties. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice steady. "And trust me, you're going to answer for everything." The distant sound of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. Elijah exhaled, the weight of the moment settling on him. This was only the beginning. There were still others out there, still more to uncover. But for now, they had the leader, and that was a start. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into the leader's wrists as Elijah tightened them, ensuring the man was fully restrained. The leader struggled briefly before going still, his chest heaving from exertion. His sharp, hate-filled eyes bore into Elijah, who remained calm despite the tension crackling in the air. The other two men lay face down in the dirt, their hands cuffed behind them, while Lopez kept her weapon trained on the group. The faint glow of approaching sirens flickered through the trees, but they weren't close enough to ease the knot in Elijah's chest. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with," the leader growled, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over." Elijah crouched beside him, his voice steady but edged with steel. "It is for you. Whatever plans you had, they're finished. You're done." The leader's lips curled into a twisted grin, his breath hissing through his teeth. "You think taking me down changes anything? You think this stops here?" He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You're fighting a war you've already lost." Lopez stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're the one cuffed and face down in the dirt. Looks to me like you're the one who lost." The leader's grin only widened, his defiance growing with every word. "You don't get it, do you? I'm nothing. Just one voice in a crowd. You can take me in, lock me up, throw away the key. It doesn't matter. There are hundreds like me. Thousands. And they'll carry out the mission." Elijah's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the leader's collar and pulled him up slightly. "What mission?" he demanded. "What are you planning?" The leader stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then his smile returned, slow and menacing. "You'll find out soon enough." Before Elijah could press further, Lopez's nose wrinkled, her head snapping up. "Do you smell that?" she asked, her voice tinged with alarm. Elijah froze, his senses sharpening. A faint, acrid smell filled the air, sharp and unmistakable. Smoke. Lopez turned, scanning the tree line. "It's coming from the city." Elijah followed her gaze, his stomach sinking as he saw it. A thin plume of smoke curling into the night sky, its dark tendrils illuminated by the faint glow of flames. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "They've already started," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader chuckled darkly, drawing their attention back to him. "You're too late," he said, his tone smug. "While you've been chasing me, the others have been busy. By the time you reach the city, it'll be chaos, fires, fear, and you'll never know where it's coming from next." Lopez's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "We need to move. Now." Elijah rose to his feet, his mind racing. The leader's words weren't just a taunt. They were a declaration. This wasn't about one attack or one neighborhood. It was about creating a wave of terror that would ripple through the entire city. He grabbed his radio, his voice sharp and commanding. "Reynolds, Carter here. We've got smoke rising from the city." It started. The response was immediate, crackling with urgency. "We're seeing it too. Reports are coming in from multiple locations. Fires, vandalism, attacks. It's coordinated, Chief. They've scattered." Elijah's grip tightened on the radio. "We've got the leader and 2 of his men in custody, but there are more out there. Mobilize every available unit. We need to lock this city down." "Already on it," Reynolds replied. "But it's bad, Carter. They've hit at least 3 locations already. We're stretched thin." Elijah's jaw clenched as he glanced at Lopez. Her expression mirrored his own, a mix of anger, frustration, and grim determination. "We're bringing these 3 in," he said into the radio. "Once we've secured them, we'll coordinate the response." "Understood. Be careful out there." Elijah clipped the radio back to his belt and turned to Lopez. "Secure the map," he said. "It's the only way we'll know where they're targeting next." She nodded, moving quickly to retrieve the crumpled paper from where it had fallen during the scuffle. Meanwhile, Elijah hauled the leader to his feet, his grip firm as he locked eyes with the man. "This ends tonight," Elijah said, his voice low but deadly serious. "You think you can terrorize this city and get away with it? Not on my watch." The leader's grin faltered for the first time, but his defiance didn't waver. "You can try to stop it," he said, his voice quieter now but no less venomous. "But you can't stop all of us." Elijah pushed him forward, his resolve hardening with every step. The faint glow of flames in the distance served as a stark reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about saving lives. The drive back to the precinct was tense and silent, the weight of urgency hanging over Elijah and Lopez like a storm cloud. The leader sat cuffed in the back seat, his smug expression lit by the intermittent glow of street lights. He didn't speak, but the glint in his eyes made Elijah's grip on the wheel tighten. Smoke was now visible across multiple sections of the city, curling into the night sky like sinister markers of chaos. The radio crackled with frantic reports from officers on the ground. Fires erupting in residential neighborhoods, vandalism of businesses, and reports of scattered attacks on individuals. The city was unraveling, and Elijah knew they were racing against time to contain the damage. Lopez tapped her phone, scrolling through live updates. 3 fires confirmed so far, she said, her tone clipped. 1 in a park, 1 at a local business, and another near a school. No casualties reported yet, but people are scared. They're calling it a coordinated attack. Elijah's jaw clenched as he turned onto a main road leading toward the precinct. That's exactly what it is. And if we don't move fast, it's going to get worse. The leader chuckled softly from the back seat, drawing their attention. You're wasting your time, he said, his voice taunting. You think locking me up is going to change anything? This city's already burning. Lopez turned in her seat, her glare sharp enough to cut. We're going to stop every last one of your men. And when we do, your name will go down as nothing but a pathetic footnote. The leader smirked, unbothered by her words. You think they need me? They don't. They've been planning this for months. You can't stop it now. Shut up, Elijah said coldly, his focus on the road. You'll have your chance to talk at the station. As they pulled into the precinct, the scene was chaotic. Officers scrambled to gear up, their radios buzzing with orders and updates. SWAT vans lined the lot, their teams preparing for rapid deployment. Elijah parked the car and stepped out, his ribs protesting with each movement. But he ignored the pain. There wasn't time to slow down. Captain Reynolds approached, his face lined with tension. Carter, he said, his voice brisk. We've got reports coming in from all over the city. Fires, assaults, graffiti with hate symbols. It's an absolute mess. And we're still trying to track down the rest of these lunatics. Elijah nodded, gesturing toward the car. We've got their leader and 2 of his men. They've confirmed it's coordinated. The map they were using should give us their next targets. Reynolds motioned for 2 officers to take the men into custody. The leader was dragged from the car, his smug demeanor faltering slightly as he was marched toward the station. Elijah turned to Lopez. Get the map to Intel. I want locations pinpointed and teams deployed within minutes. On it, Lopez said, jogging toward the command center set up near the precinct entrance. Reynolds crossed his arms, his expression grim. How bad is it? Bad, Elijah admitted. They're organized, confident, and they're willing to take this as far as they can. But we've got their plans now. If we move fast, we can cut them off before they do more damage. Reynolds nodded, his gaze hard. SWAT's ready to move. I've got patrol units covering the hot zones, but we're stretched thin. If they keep hitting random targets, it's going to take everything we've got to keep up. Elijah exhaled sharply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. We don't have a choice. We focus on the areas they've marked first, and hope we can catch enough of them to send a message. Lopez returned moments later, her expression urgent. We've got the locations, she said, holding up a tablet. They're targeting 5 more spots tonight. 3 residential areas, a community center, and a hospital. Elijah's stomach turned at the mention of the hospital. They're trying to maximize fear, he muttered. If they hit a hospital. They won't, Reynolds said firmly. We'll stop them. Elijah nodded, his determination hardening. Split the teams. SWAT takes the hospital and the community center. Patrol units cover the residential areas. I'll lead one of the patrols. Reynolds frowned. Carter, you're injured. You should be coordinating from here. With all due respect, Captain, Elijah said, his voice steady. I'm not sitting behind a desk while my city burns. I'll be careful, but I'm going. Reynolds held his gaze for a moment before nodding. All right, just don't do anything stupid. Lopez handed Elijah a tactical vest, her expression serious. We're going to stop them, she said, more to herself than anyone else. We have to. Elijah pulled on the vest, the weight of it grounding him. We will, he said, his voice firm, because failure isn't an option. The teams mobilized quickly, the roar of engines filling the air as SWAT vans and patrol cars peeled out of the lot. Elijah and Lopez climbed into their vehicle, the urgency of the moment propelling them forward. As they sped toward their assigned target, Elijah's mind raced. This wasn't just about arrests or containment. This was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. And he wouldn't stop until every last one of these men was brought to justice. Captain Reynolds gripped the dashboard as the SWAT van hurtled through the city streets, its sirens slicing through the chaos. Inside, the team of officers sat in grim silence, the faint clinks of weapons being loaded the only sound. Smoke from nearby fires hung in the air, a constant reminder of how high the stakes were tonight. The van screeched to a halt a block from the community center, where shouts and crashes punctuated the night. Reynolds stepped out, his radio already crackling with updates. Officers from nearby patrols had cordoned off the area, but they hadn't dared to approach the barricade erected in the parking lot. "What's the situation?" Reynolds barked at a sergeant, who pointed toward the scene. "About 20 of them, maybe more," the sergeant reported, his face tense. "They've got bats, pipes, maybe a gun or two. They've set trash bins on fire and started smashing cars in the lot. Civilians are holed up in the community center, but they're terrified." Reynolds scanned the chaos. The mob of skinheads was clustered around a makeshift barricade of overturned tables and metal scraps, their chants loud and aggressive. The flames from the trash bins cast eerie shadows on their faces, making their sneering expressions even more menacing. "This city doesn't belong to them," one of the skinheads bellowed, brandishing a bat as he stood atop the barricade. "We're taking it back. Let them come. We'll show them what happens when they try to take what's ours." The mob cheered, their fists raised in the air. Another man, his face streaked with soot, slammed a pipe against a car window,